welcome back to the Bone Club. It's I, Ashley, and we finally have back with us Stephanie and Jenna back from their um, ailments of last time. And this time we also have a very special guest with us, Dr. Tracy Rogers from the University of Toronto, who happens to be my supervisor as well. She was Jenna's supervisor, and so we're pleased to have her on the Bone Club with us this week. So she's going to be talking to us about the complexities of various different types of cases, which I think is going to be of great interest to a lot of folks, because what we find in forensic anthropology in particular is every case is different. No one case is the same. And so what we learn from one case, we can move to another, but every single case is unique. And so with that, I'd like to go ahead and get started. Dr. Rogers, would you like to say hello to everybody?
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here.
So,
Hi, Tracy. It's so good to see you. So one of the questions we like to ask first of our guests is, what got you interested in forensic anthropology? How did you find yourself here in the field?
Well, you'll have to remember that when I started, forensic anthropology wasn't a thing. That was well before bones and all of the big forensic science programs that came out. So I didn't really know about it when I went to university. I went with the idea that I wanted to do something that would be able to help people. So I was thinking of the typical things, doctor, lawyer, psychiatrist, something along those lines. But I found anthropology in first year and I just loved everything about it, even the cultural, the biological, the archaeology. I loved it all. And by second year, I kind of narrowed it to archaeology and biological anthropology. And by third year, I finally heard about forensic anthropology and saw how I could help people in real time by doing something amazing, like looking at the human skeleton and understanding who these people were and what had happened to them. So that was sort of the way I eventually found forensic anthropology. And I usually tell people the story about how it's really seriously debating between archaeology and forensic anthropology. And I went on an archaeological dig with a graduate student to assist. And I spent the entire day screening and we found absolutely nothing. And that was it. I was done. It was forensic anthropology all the way. Even though I do love to do scene work and out there screening and all the same things, but forensic anthropology, we definitely have, I think, a greater return on our search efforts than in archaeology, where they often spend a long time searching and don't find anything.
and you have trained a number of anthropologists, particularly in Canada. And I count myself among the many lucky who you've trained in this field. So I've learned a lot in how to go about working in the field and working in the lab from you. So that I do thank you for. And we welcome you to the Bone Club here because we wanted to talk to you about the complexities of various different scenes, massive scenes, small scenes. And the reason why is because you have worked some of those really large, complex scenes. And one of them that particularly Americans don't really know about is that of Robert Pickton, where you were one of the lead anthropologists. And for those that don't know, Robert Pickton was a pig farmer and a serial killer who operated in Port Coquitlam in British Columbia. I have a hard time pronouncing that town's name. It's about 17 miles or 27 kilometers east of Vancouver. In February of 2002, police executed a search warrant for illegal firearms. And while they were there, they had found some personal items that had belonged to some missing women and applied for a second search warrant. This ultimately kicked off what would be an extensive excavation of the Pickton property. And ultimately, Robert Pickton was convicted of second-degree murder in for the murder of 6 women, and he was accused of first-degree murder for an additional 21 other women. He also supposedly confessed to an undercover RCMP officer disguised as a cellmate that he had murdered up to 49 other women. And I should mention that he had a particular type of woman that he went after, and those were indigenous women, sex workers, um, transient women. So he had a particular type of women that he went after, marginalized women in the community. So I guess one of the first questions I wanted to ask you is, when you have a site that is as massive and complex as the Pickton site was, what are some of the ways that you first get organized to tackle such a challenge?
Well, in order to give the listeners a bit of a sense of what you mean by large site, this was the main property was about 16 acres that we decided had to be searched completely all the way down to sterile soil, because although when the police went on with the second search warrant and were able to look into the property, initially they discovered that this individual had been, Robert Pickton had been dismembering the women, and not all of the bodies or body pieces were visible, in their initial walkthrough. So clearly he had done something with them, and they weren't sure exactly what. We've determined that in order to search thoroughly, the entire property had to be excavated down to sterile. And in some cases, this was maybe 6 feet deep that we had to go down. And in other places, it was over 30 feet that we had to go down before we were able to determine that this was sterile ground and that nothing was buried below. And in a number of places, we were actually in the water table before we could clear the area. So that just gives you an idea of the size, and in some ways the depth that we had to go down into that site. There were also buildings on the property and cars, and there were cars buried in the property, and there were it was a farm, so there were pigs buried on the property and cows buried on the property. So there was a lot to actually have to work with there. And then when some of the remains became when we were able to finally locate some of the remains, we noticed there was a pattern between that case and a case that we had seen a few years previously. And that linked us to a second site. And that was another, I think, approximately 14 acres that we had to search. That one, the individual that was located on the surface. So we felt that we probably didn't have to do such an in-depth excavation as at the original site. It seemed that perhaps this was a site that he had maybe been transporting the bodies across, or parts of bodies across. And so we did a very thorough uh, walkthrough search. We raked through, we cut down all the long grasses on that site. There was a slough, like a standing water. We had the divers in for that. And then in the main part of the meadow, we actually did peel back some of the turf in a sort of checkerboard pattern to try and excavate below in various areas in order to determine whether there was likely any disturbances that we needed to consider, and make sure that he wasn't actually trying to bury bodies on that property. And we were able to determine that it was not that likely. The kind of time frame was that we were getting artifacts from were outside of the scope of what we think he was operating in that area. So we did spend a couple weeks there, but the main concentration was on the main property, and we spent a year and a half there. So that gives you some idea of just how big and how intense this site was. And in order to be able to get the entire property searched down to sterile, we had to incorporate heavy machinery. So there was a lot of logistics that went into the planning for this site. And every scene has its own logistics, but when you're working with a smaller scene, you have your sort of usual set of tools you take, you have your usual support team that comes with you, you have your very typical coroners that you work with for the region or the police agencies you work for the region. But this investigation, when you are dealing with these larger types of scenes, this one was a joint effort between the RCMP and the Vancouver police. So we already had two police agencies involved. And then, of course, the coroner and the Office of the Chief Coroner. And so one of the challenges is that the logistics just become that more complex, right? You have more agencies involved, you have more people and uh, more expectations about the way things get done. So one of the big things is just working out the logistics of who reports to who, how should the process work, what is the protocol for doing everything, because not everybody knows, right? Not everybody who's helping on a more complex scene like this or who's involved has ever even been on a straightforward forensic anthropological case before. So there's a lot of information sharing that has to go on, and planning and logistics that have to go on, that are at a much larger scale than a typical scene. We also have to think about the equipment. So, in a normal scene, you have probably your basic kit and all the equipment, screens, et cetera, that you take with you. But on a property the size of what we were dealing with Pickton, we really had to think on a much larger scale. So that involved dump trucks, excavators, conveyor belts, screening, automatic or machine screening. It involved this level of um, machinery, etc., and everything to support it, all the expert drivers and the safety people and all of those things that go along with making sure that this will work well. So on one hand, it's the same types of issues. It's making sure you have the logistics sorted, making sure you have the personnel, making sure you have the equipment and the resources, but it's at a much potentially more complex scale.
I say for all the American listeners, because I know I didn't necessarily know this, RCMP is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So just like their police. I know I like looked at my phone. I was like, I should probably figure out what RCMP means. So for our listeners, that's what that that is. You'll probably hear that quite a bit today. When thinking about like training, because you were saying that like many people who are assisting with these larger scale excavations might not have ever worked specifically a forensic anthropology scene, but maybe even a forensic scene at all. Like some excavators, they might know how to drive the machinery, but have never been on a forensic site. When training them how to do it in the way that you need it done, I guess, what types of like precursor PowerPoint presentation, I don't know, something is given to them in order to understand like how to work with human remains and potentially like what human remains look like. So like when they're going and doing their backhoe and they see something in their like I don't know what the little arm thing's called for an excavator, but is it up to you as the anthropologist or the anthropology team to be like, stop, we need to like, before you just toss this dirt into a pile, we need to like hold? Or are they trained to kind of keep an eye on certain things like that? I guess it's like what kind of training goes into those non-forensic team members?
So that's a really good question, because training and training your eye for what to look for is really quite critical. So one of the things that we did with all of the excavators was to really find out what they were capable of, because you have no idea. I mean, they've worked on, you try to find the experts that have done a lot of work with, with excavation machinery. And when we talked with them, we found out that they can detect minor differences in the ground texture. They are really good at seeing differences in soil color, etc. So they were really already good at detecting and seeing differences. Um, And just to give you an idea of the process, what would happen is we, just like a regular scene, set out a grid, but these ones were much bigger. They were 20 by 20 meters. So it was quite a large grid system. And we would do one unit at a time. So we would have an excavator in the unit, and we had an anthropology technician monitoring, so they were looking in as the excavator was also looking at what they were excavating. So if either one of them saw something, then they would pause. And then I would go in and check out what it was they saw. So we had that system in place. Then anything that got, all the soil that got excavated went into a dump truck. And then the dump truck would be put through, the soil in the dump truck went through a machine called the Grizzly, which was a sorting machine. And then that was set at 3 different sizes. And the 3 different sizes of materials that it was sorting would go out on conveyor belts. And the anthropology technicians were actually along the conveyor belts. And their job was to, keeping their hands in all that soil that was coming by on the conveyor, pick out anything that wasn't soil. So they were picking out, you know, needles and garbage and anything. Animal bone, of course, bone of any kind, anything that was just not part of the soil, they would pull that out. And we worked in 1 hour blocks, so that everything got timed. We knew exactly what unit we were working in. We knew who was working on the conveyors at that time. And so anything that got taken out got put into they had buckets and they had tables behind them where all of the things that they located in that hour would be put. And then the next team would come in at the end of the hour, and the team that was just leaving would make sure they had all the information about what unit it was, what the time frame was, and then they would go up and further complete all the paperwork to go with it. So we had that chain of custody going the whole way. And of course, our technicians didn't always know kind of the full scope of what forensic anthropology is all about and how you maintain chain of custody and all of that. So they all had to be trained in the process of chain of custody. We had, I think at one point, and for quite a while, we had over 100 anthropology technicians working on that site because we had a whole team on for an hour, and then they would have to go off and another team would be on for the next hour, and then they'd alternate all day long. And the reason for that is because when all of the debris and potentially human remains were going past on the conveyor, if anybody sort of didn't see something and a piece of someone went off the conveyor, that was the last time that anybody would have eyes on that, that possible person there. And so we wanted people to be standing at that conveyor with fresh eyes. We wanted to make sure that we didn't miss anything. So we actually had, I think it was, depending on which conveyor they were on, we had something like 6 on one side and 6 on the other side. So anything that got missed by the first 2 would be caught by the second 2 or the third 2 right as it went down the line. And then at the very end, the conveyor kind of went up and it dropped off the end. And then we had 2 more people watching as things came off the end. And so they could hopefully see anything that kind of lit up as it fell down. And then they would pull that out with rakes. And so all of the things that they pulled out and they documented came to me if it was potentially organic or bone. And I examined all of that, as well as going to the unit that was being excavated if somebody saw something in the moment, right? So it took a little while to work out that protocol. In order to get that protocol figured out and the way to build in those redundancies and make sure that we weren't overlooking anything, a couple of the police officers who were in charge of the logistics of the setup, they went down to the site of the Twin Towers because this project began in February of 2002 and the Twin Towers came down in 2001. So the search at the Twin Towers was really getting going and had really begun to be established by the time the Pickton site came along. And we actually had a good look at how that was being dealt with. to search through debris for people in such a large scale. And so we adapted that, they adapted that methodology, and then everybody had to be trained in it, including these 100 techs of the anthro techs, because uh, Canada isn't as big as the US, and the number of forensic anthropologists in Canada is very small. And at that time, it was even smaller. And so the students available and the recently graduated people available to assist with this process was quite a small number. So we had to end up hiring also some archaeologists, bioarchaeologists, etc. And most of them had no experience at all with forensic anthro. So I did have to do a few presentations to explain kind of what we're looking for and how we're looking for it and why we're looking for it and how we need to behave. And then, of course, the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they had a couple of presentations themselves talking more about the investigation, the importance of chain of custody, and they came at it from that perspective. And then, of course, there was safety, and basically everybody was presenting to everybody else so that we all hopefully had a really good, solid understanding of what needed to be done. And I also did a bit of training on what to be looking for. So I brought in some examples, showed the team what they were looking for. And then we did a bit of training where uh, we told them we're going to do this. So that wasn't like complete out of the blue, but we took a couple of animal bones and put it through the system so that we could see if we could actually find it. Like, did the system work? Because it seemed like a great idea, but until you try it, you don't actually know if it's going to work, right? Do we have enough redundancy built in? Are we separating things small enough? All of those things. And thankfully, we did find the ones that we put in as our tests, so we knew it was working well. And of course, it didn't start off, in this perfect way right at the very beginning. We had to figure out a lot of details, like what do you put over people so they're not standing in the rain as they're trying to do this job, right? Um, how high do you, some of the things are kind of funny that you don't probably think about. We're working on conveyor belts. We had somebody who was less than 5 feet tall, and we had another person who was over 6 feet. So what height do you set the conveyor belt at just to make it ergonomically comfortable for the whole team, right? And so we had a couple people who had to be on step stools and eventually, and we had ergonomic pads, and we had like there was a lot of work that went into how to make this a functional and safe place for the people to work. Um,
For
one of the
sites
other
like,
things, oh,
oh,
sorry,
sorry. For sites like this, I know, at least on the American side, a lot of times, or at least the ones that I've been a part of, the police are technically in charge of all of it, and you're just there as like a consult of like, this is what I would do if I was in charge. Do you find on the Canadian side it runs kind of the same way, or do they hand over a little more power because it is your specialty? Um, yeah, I guess that's my question.
that's another good question. It depends a little bit on who you're working with, and probably the same in the US if they've ever worked with you before, right? So if they know you and they know what you're capable of, they're much more likely to sort of say, okay, this is what we need. And now you tell us what you need, and you kind of work together and make it happen. When we started at Pickton, uh, the person who introduced me to the lead, um, and I'd say lead site investigators, he knew me. And so he introduced me and said, she's going to be really helpful, etc. And I explained to them what I can do. One of the coroners that was working at the time had a lot of experience working with recovery human remains, and I knew him. So there was an introduction there, but it wasn't quite the same as having worked with people in the past and they know what you can do and all of that sort of thing. So at first there was a little bit more, you know, they're in charge, this is the way they want it. But then when I would make suggestions and explain to them why things really would be better if it went in this direction or that direction, they were really good about it. For the most part, I think the team worked really well together. There were a couple things that, people have to learn the hard way, which is funny after the fact, but in the moment is a little frustrating. So one of the things, as an example, one of the things that we encountered at the Pickton site was because it was a farm and they buried a lot of animals on the farm. There were areas where there would be 2 or 3, say, cows buried together. And because of the water table, you'd get massive amounts of adipocere. So think of a person, think of a cow, think of how much adipocere that will be. Okay, so our lovely logistics people thought that it would be a good idea to just put all the soil and the cow bones and adipocere through the same process as everything else. And I suggested that wasn't a good idea because adipocere you really don't want going through your screens and all of that. But sometimes people have to try and see what happens. And so I think it took about a day and a half or 2 days to clean out the screen and the conveyors so that things would work properly and we could move forward. So that led to a whole new protocol specific to these kinds of adipocere areas. And it actually led to a really nice protocol, really good protocol, I think, where the whole team would go in all the personal protective equipment and they had rakes and the excavator would excavate out what appeared to be the extent. After I had gone into the pit and said, I don't see any human bone here, we'll take it out. And then they laid it down on an area that had already been searched. And the team went through with rakes and they pulled everything out. And so they pulled out all the bone, they pulled out everything. And then I was able to go through and just examine everything individually. And so that worked out really well. And of course, all that adipocere could then go back into a pit because we did not need to keep it. And that worked much better. But after those kinds of experiences where people learn the hard way, they do tend to listen to you a little bit sooner in the process, I've found.
Speaking of learning the hard way, and you've mentioned it a couple times of trying to adapt. One of the things that I've learned working on a lot of scenes is you develop a plan and you've done your research before you show up, you've developed a plan, you know exactly what you're going to do, and you show up, and 5 minutes after you've shown up, it's obsolete almost because the situation on the scene has changed to some degree that you were not expecting, or information that you should have been given was not given or was incorrect, anything of that nature. So what challenges do you find both with a case similar to Pickton, whether it be as large and as massive as Pickton was, or other sort of cases like that, or even just a small, straightforward case? What challenges do you find, and how do you overcome them when it comes to that? All right, I have my plan. I show up, and well, this isn't what I planned on.
Well, going into a scene, I like to think of the plan as more of a living document, an adaptable kind of plan. You go in hopefully covering as many of the bases as possible with the idea of how you're going to approach it. And I usually write that all down so I have it documented how we're going to start anyways, or what the general plan is. And then when you get that new information or things are changing, I find that it is easier to adapt than to have to start, like if you came to the scene and you didn't even have a starting point, right? It's much easier, it's much quicker to adapt an existing plan than to kind of arrive cold and have to develop it in the moment. It's also really, I find, helpful from the perspective of documentation and if you have to go to court to explain what you did, because if you've got the plan and you have a reason for changing that plan and you document your reason, then all that entire process is there. And when you go to court, you can explain it. It makes sense. You don't get a lot of pushback from anyone about why you did this or why you did that, because you can explain everything that you did. And yes, of course, there's many different ways to process a scene. You know, if I do it, great, but somebody else might not do it exactly the same way, and it will still be great, because as long as you're doing it in a really systematic way and you're ideally ensuring that you're going from the area with the least amount of potential evidence so that you can approach it carefully and collect everything as you're going, then regardless of exactly how you do it, you should at the end both come out with very good results. So I find the ability to explain the plan afterwards, and make sure it is systematic and make sure it is thorough. It works if you have a plan, but if you kind of come to the scene and you go, oh, this looks like this is happening and this looks like that. I think I need to try this. And then if that's not working, I'm going to try that. It becomes really piecemeal and a bit like, you know, a shot in the dark. So that's definitely not a way to approach any scene. And the more complex the scene, the greater the chances are you're going to overlook something.
So when you do show up, though, you have that in it, that initial information and that scene information. You've developed a plan, you've surveyed, and you've started to encounter some of the initial unknowns. Overall, what are some of the major challenges that come into place when you're processing uh, different types of scenes, when you're processing something as large and as Pickton, or as complex as Pickton, or as something as house fires, that as fire scenes? Um, what are some of those challenges that you come across that you have to figure out how to deal with when you've made that initial assessment?
I would say, you know, because there are so many scenes and they can be complex in different ways, you really do have to be adaptable and be able to think on your feet on the best way to approach things. I find one of the big challenges, though, regardless of the scene type, is the expectation that things should happen fast, 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 right? Because especially if it's a case that's evolving in the moment. So I've had some cases where they're trying to find the suspect as we're processing the scene, and things are happening so fast, new information is coming in, it's changing things. And it's really interesting and exciting to see how this case is evolving. But at the same time, people are expecting that you're going to give them this answer now because they need it now, because they need to follow up on this lead or that lead, or should be they doing this or should they be doing that, right? And so other investigators can put a lot of pressure on saying we need this and we need it fast. But of course, forensic anthropologists out there will know that you don't want to approach a scene fast, because the faster you go and the more you're rushing trying to get something, there's a greater chance you're actually going to miss something, and that's going to be a huge problem. So trying to slow people down to do it right in the moment when there's a lot of pressure to go fast is a big challenge, and to convey the importance of doing it at the correct speed. So I like to say we don't do it fast, we do it efficiently, right? We want to do it as quickly as we can, but doing it properly, right? So if we can't do it properly, we need to slow it down to make sure we are doing it properly. And so that's always a huge challenge, just trying to manage, in a way, manage the expectations of the investigators on how fast or how slow or why you're here or why you're there. But if they are briefed at the beginning, there's much greater chance that they're going to accept it. They're still going to probably say, do you have it yet? But they're going to be they're going to be a little more trusting that you're doing it at the pace it needs to be done. Jenna?
Alrighty, so on a scene of that's like scale, if it's moving at a pace of about a year and a half, like that is not quick. And so at that point, do you get to make the call about when to close a scene like that? Do you get told to close a scene like that? And if you are deciding when to close that scene, is it a psychological challenge to know and be able to tell yourself like I think I found everything I I could find, or I've literally found everything that is there? Like, when do you call it?
So in the Pickton case, it's interesting because there were 3 scenes associated with that case. And one where the farmhouse was and where Robert Pickton's trailer was, the main property. The decision was made almost from the beginning that the site would have to be searched in its entirety. And it was going to be searched down to sterile, and that was the end. So that was nice because that decision was made and I agreed with it. And, it would have been the decision I would have made anyways, but the scale and the time and the resources and the cost and all of that sort of thing is something that is well above what I would normally work with, costing in the millions of dollars to do this one scene. So I was happy that those decisions were made at a much, much higher level when we considered, what we actually knew, what was likely, how could we be sure that all of these women were searched for properly, etc. And that decision was made that we need to make sure that we can go back to those families and say, we fully searched this scene and they're not there. If we didn't find them, then we're quite confident they're not there. Now, in the second scene, because it wasn't his property, it was just an area where, people walk through and we think that he probably had walked through at some point. The approach was a little bit different, and we did a thorough search, including, raking, and there were some little slopes and there were tall meadow grasses, which we cut down and we hand searched and all of these things. So we did all of these things very thorough as well. But there was a little bit more reliance on me to tell them what I thought needed to be done. And when I was satisfied that we had done everything we needed to do to be certain that there were not more kind of remains left at that site. And at that one, because we didn't completely excavate everything down to the ground, down to the groundwater, uh, there is that potential that maybe we've overlooked something. But at the same time, we did such a thorough ground search that I feel pretty confident. And the areas that we did excavate, we did in a really systematic way. And so I was pretty confident that we ruled out those possibilities. But as you know, you can never be 100% certain unless, like in the first scene, you can actually excavate it right down to groundwater. So
Do you find that when making those types of decisions, it has gotten easier throughout your career of like, you've seen more cases, maybe less so for the Picton case, but like your smaller, more quote unquote traditional type of scenes where you're like, okay, I've seen 10 of these beforehand. I know pretty much exactly what we're doing, and you feel more confident? Or do you still feel similar to your first scenes where you're like, no, it's still a hard decision to say, no, we have to call it quits on we think we've done enough?
well, I would say in some ways it's gotten a little easier because you do see the patterns, right? So I always consider, uh, I guess the ones that tend to be the most challenging are the ones that are scattered remains, because obviously if you have a grave and you're able to excavate fully, great, you're happy. But the scattered cases are the tricky ones because we get, coyotes, we get bears. They will take body parts really far away, like miles away. So in some ways, you have to acknowledge the reality that you just may not be able to recover the entire person. So given that that is a reality of these kinds of scenes, then we try to work from, what are the scatter patterns normally associated with coyotes? What are the patterns normally associated with bears? Which one are we dealing with here? Where can we expect to look? How far can we take that? And in Canada, and in Ontario in particular, we have a nice sort of overlapping system. So we have the forensic anthropologist that has that skill set and will make decisions about, okay, this is what the expectations are, this is how we're going to search. But we do that also in conjunction with the search and rescue teams. And these are typically, there's an Ontario one in Ontario. So there's usually a provincial kind of search and rescue, and there might be more local ones for particular municipalities, and we work with them. They will go in a much bigger area that we tend to search because they do, the hasty searches. So they're going through and they've got their GPS and they're tracking their complete lines, etc. So we've got them going through. And if they see anything at all, that helps kind of set some boundaries and, when are we seeing things and how long has it been since we've seen things? Whereas the forensic anthropologist is focusing a bit more on the main concentration and working out from there typically. And then we also have canine units that go through. So they help us when we reach the end of where we can say, okay, the pattern is, fading here. I'm not sure where it's going. And we'll also look at the distance from one piece to the next piece, like how far have we actually had to go before we found this next piece. And that helps kind of figure out, how much further might we have to go just to find the next piece. And so the dogs are really good that way too, because they can go through quickly and they can help maybe find one or two isolated pieces. And then of course there's the coroner, who in Canada has the legal responsibility for the remains. So we work with them. And so all of these people, the lead of the search and rescue, the lead of the canine unit, me, and the coroner would all have a conversation about, do we think that we have reached the extent that is, let's say, feasible? Because you can always keep going, but is it even feasible? Are we likely to find any more of this person? And of course, we look at what actually are we missing as well, because if we're missing key pieces of a person, then ideally we want to continue looking until we find them. If you find most of the body but not the skull, it's a bit of an odd one, and we know that coyotes will roll them and move them. So yeah, so we kind of track those patterns and try to see if we can locate that missing skull. Of course, it's really important to do that kind of recovery. If it's a few smaller pieces, then that might mean a bit less of a not a concern, because we're concerned to recover the entire person, and that's always the goal. But it's just probably less likely that we might find some of those smaller pieces if we reach this really large scatter, which we do quite frequently.
Along those lines, not just with feasibility and efficiency, thinking, and I know you didn't work this case, but thinking to Winnipeg, where they recently recovered a couple of murdered Indigenous women from a landfill outside of Winnipeg. Is there ever, and thankfully they did go in and finally and do an excavation and finally recovered them, but is there ever a situation where you would say that's unsafe, or the collective team you're working with would say, we know the individual is there, but we can't go in because of safety concerns. We don't want to put our team in that line. Does safety come in some way?
Yeah, safety is a really important factor. It's always a primary consideration, but there are so many ways to mitigate. So even with the landfill case in Manitoba, I never considered that to be not feasible. That was always a feasible search. But yes, there was asbestos, so you get an asbestos specialist in to deal with that piece of that problem. There are issues with the height and the stability of all of the debris in the landfill, but the people who run the landfill deal with that all the time. So there are ways to mitigate those issues. And in the Pickton case, for example, when you're starting to get down to these 30 feet that you're your unit's 30 feet deep, of course, there's all kinds of issues relating to the side walls being potentially kind of slumping in and that sort of thing. So there are other safety issues that we had to worry about there. We did have needles found on the property and even in the soil. So there were puncture-proof gloves. We had full PPE. They had respirators. There's, so many ways to really mitigate some of these problems. And even in cases like where there are bears, that is not a safe place to be around bears. But if you have somebody in there whose job it is to look for bears and they are there with a gun in hand, ready to deal with any bears should they get out of control. And, those types of things, they can all pretty much, I would say almost everything. I wouldn't say it would never happen that you would say you can't do it, but there's so many ways that you can manage the safety issues that I would really be reluctant to ever say, no, it's not feasible to search for your loved ones, because I think there probably is a way that it could be managed.
No, and just to push the question just a little, that envelope a little bit farther, that question a little bit farther. And I know we've seen what happened in New York with the Twin Towers and how the New York OCME dealt with that, how y'all dealt with the Pickton property, how DC's, or actually how Virginia's ME's office and others dealt with the Pentagon and other different mass casualty events. But can you envision a situation where we'd reach, or a case would reach critical mass, say? It's too big. There's just no real way to get a handle around it. And if not, if there is, how do you get a handle around it? How do you address that?
Well, I think most cases, I think there would be always a way to approach it, because everything is a matter of scale, right? So if you divide it into smaller sections and do a section at a time, when it becomes, I think, unmanageable is when people have these unrealistic expectations. Like they're not going to pay more than a X number of dollars. You can't have more than X number of people. They're not going to provide whatever equipment is necessary, right? But if you have that willingness, then yes, it might take a year and a half and it may take over 200 people working 6 or 7 days a week, but you can do it, right? And, yes, a landfill is not the ideal place to be searching in, but when you organize it and when you identify the likely areas and when you divide it up into more manageable protocols and steps, then it can be done. So I would say probably most things. Imagine there are probably locations where it would become incredibly difficult, where you might have to be roped in or, something along those lines. And that might cause a number of logistics issues that make it quite difficult to the point of maybe being impossible. So I wouldn't entirely rule it out. But I would say that as long as you had the support necessary, there are ways of managing very large scenes.
I know we're kind of coming up on our time, but I have one kind of somewhat broad spectrum question to kind of go with this is, I know a lot of times, at least on the US side of things, um, we might have more anthropologists than Canada does, but we're also pretty spread out. Like there's not necessarily like 8 anthropologists. Like I'm probably in one of the few places where there's just a horde of us in one area. Usually there's like one per state or something like that. Um, and then with that comes often anthropologists get asked to help out with the scene, but aren't necessarily paid for their time and expertise and things like that. Do you find that Canada is different in that way, that they like, I don't want to say value y'all more, but like value the expertise to pay for that type of skill? Or do you still like, are you predominantly paid through say your university and you volunteer your time out to do scenes? Because I know a lot of times that's how it works on the like on the US side.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question because each jurisdiction seems to do it slightly differently. But overall, I think in Canada, it runs one of two ways. They either know what forensic anthropologists can do and they value us and they want us involved and we are paid, or they don't know what we do, you tell them and they're still not sure and they just decline altogether. So we're hoping that there are less of those areas and more of the ones that utilize forensic anthropology on a regular basis. But I guess one of the ideas in the Canadian legal system is that seems to underlie this process is that experts are people who do this professionally and a professional gets paid. So you can't be an expert witness and go to court if you're not being paid as a professional to do this job, right? And so if you volunteer your time and you had to go to court, then you would be, a hobbyist or you would be a civilian person or you would be something other than a professional and a subject matter expert. So that that helps certainly with the idea of the need to have your experts paid for the work that they do.
Why did
I'm
I
not saying
move back to the States?
I'm not saying they always pay us well, but we do get paid.
Well, I I want to thank you for joining us. I do have one last question though, and that is you've worked all different types of scenes, and I just is there a type of scene that you prefer to work that it's I don't want to say it's enjoyable, but you like to work that you yeah that you prefer to work.
I actually find all types of scenes really interesting, and I enjoy the challenge of doing different kinds of scenes. So from that perspective, yes, I would say enjoy them. And every scene has its sort of something that's unique about it that makes it so interesting to be there and to, be part of helping to recover that person and figure out what happened at that location. Um, Scenes that are large, like the Pickton scene, it's a really interesting kind of dynamic and it's an interesting experience because you're working with these same people for a really long time. So you get to know people in a way that you don't often on other kinds of cases. But there's also something quite satisfying of going into a case, doing a nice clean excavation and having everything kind of done it by the end of the day and be able to go home and have, enjoy the experience of meeting the new people at the new scene and working with them. So I would say there's again, there's something that's interesting. I like the big scene searches because it's usually nice to be outside and spend the day outside, organizing and working with people to locate someone whose family is waiting to hear about them. And burials are really interesting as well because they're usually, you know, get to put all the skill set together to do the nice recoveries that you kind of learn and do with all the excavation skills and that sort of thing. So fires Fires are interesting in a number of ways. And actually, I don't mind doing the fire cases at all. But the thing that is actually a little bit hard about fire cases that's different from other cases for me is that in the other cases, like a burial or someone who's died outside and body's been scattered, etc., or been deposited outside, you see them the way that somebody left them, right? Somebody left them in the burial, somebody left them out on the in this property, somebody left them in the garbage can, etc. And that to me, the lack of respect along, of course, they'd been killed, but obviously the lack of respect in the way that they've been treated, that gives me kind of almost an anger of how they've been left like that, as though they're disposable people. And so I approach those scenes from that perspective of almost being, no, I want to recover those people because they deserve better than how they've been, treated and how they've been left. But when I go to a fire scene, you're seeing the last moments of someone's life, right? And that's a different feel, because this isn't how, somebody disposed of them, I guess, unless it's an arson, and then it's a bit more of a crossover, but it's sort of them in those last moments. And those last moments can be really, really sad and terrifying when you see. And the cases, where people are so close to escaping from the fires are heartbreaking. When they're at the door, they're just, all they needed was like less than a minute more and they would have been out and alive, right? And those ones are heartbreaking. So there are some that are emotionally more, I think, challenging. And of course, ones involving kids are that much more challenging, especially since I had my own kids. That changes things, I think, sometimes that you feel it more. But all the scenes to me are really interesting for their own way. There's always some new challenge, right? Whether it's having to be roped in and going down a really steep ravine, or crawling underneath a crawl space and just trying to figure out how you're going to get into some place and out of that place again. And all of these things make it different and interesting and challenging.
My problem with fire scenes is the ones I've always worked with you. It's always negative 19 degrees Celsius.
Yes,
I'm
the
not
ones,
made for I've 10 years in Ontario. I was never made for Ontario winter.
yeah, the ones where they're frozen to the ground and you actually have to heat up the space before you can remove them from the snow and the ice
Yeah.
adds that extra layer of challenge. But and I can imagine that coming from the south, it's not a pleasant thing to be out there at -20, -30.
Well, Dr. Rogers, I want to thank you so much for joining us here this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I want to thank all of you for joining us as well on this episode of the Bone Club. And we'll be here in a couple weeks with a new episode. Until then, have a very pleasant week. Have a very pleasant couple weeks, and we'll see you in time.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Hello, friends. We here at the Bone Club understand how difficult it is for students to break into the field of forensic anthropology. To help with that cause, we have decided to monetize in a way by setting up an account with Patreon. All proceeds will be donated to the anthropology section of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences to help alleviate the cost of attending an annual scientific conference for students. If you can, we have set up 4 membership tiers with patreon.com/theboneclub that range from $3 a month to our patrons of the bones at $15 a month. We hope some of you can join us in this worthy endeavor of breaking down the barrier of cost that keeps many students away from these important conferences. So if you can, please join us at patreon.com/theboneclub. Thank you, and may your skeletons always be complete.